a news conference in Greece, the first stop of his final trip abroad as leader of the free world. Ironically, much of President Obama's mission is to serve as a liaison for his successor. Mr. Obama will likely address allies. That President Trump will also honor the U.S. commitment to NATO and its long-standing loyalties in Europe and Asia. We begin this hour in Athens, then, where CNN's Michelle Kosinski is traveling with the president. Good morning, Michelle.
Hi, Carol. Yeah, just think over this past year, as the president's been on all of these foreign trips, one after the other, meeting with key allies, one thing he's been doing is reassuring them that he didn't think there was going to be a Trump presidency. And he described other leaders as...
And so we begin today's class with a news report from CNN. And I don't know if you heard it because it was one of the first things they said in that news report, but they identified President Obama's trip abroad as him being in the capacity of the, quote, leader of the free world. Wow. The leader of the free world. I mean, certainly that's not a position that he was elected to, right? That's a statement that's really commentary. Because do you think anybody else in the world would like to think of themselves as not being free? Do you think the people that we think of as the most oppressed people in the world, do you think that they think of themselves as not being free in some sense? Are there any other leaders of any other countries out there that believe that they are leading freedom in certain areas? And so to call our president the leader of the free world, in a way, identifies a bias that we have about how we view our president. And it introduces our subject for today because our chapter is all about news reporting. And whereas we have just finished the major part of the tree in talking about content, the major part of the tree being the leaves of the tree, that the first thing that you look at when you look at a media system, you see the leaves. Now we're looking at a more specialized kind of leaf on the tree. We're looking at a news reporting leaf. These are the standout leaves. These are the leaves that show you the health of the tree. It's what a country is talking about when you listen to its news programs on radio, when you read its newspapers, when you watch its TV news, when you look at internet news that originates from that country. You're really dropping in on a conversation that that country is having about itself. And so if we look at news through that prism, we can really say that there is no such thing as objective news in the grand scheme of things, right? All news is biased. Even by choosing to carry that Obama story first, as opposed to a story on how the deficit went down, or a story on how crime went down, or a story on a hurricane that's in the Caribbean. Even covering that president's story first has a built-in bias to it because it's saying this story is more important than the others. It's our first story. So let's take a look at news and how we see it appearing in various countries. I'm not so sure how organized my information is going to be this morning. This is another very detailed chapter. It's like the accessibility chapter, and it's really something that you should sit down and dig deep into in terms of what grabs you. There will be lots of blocks of information that don't grab you, that will be repetitive, redundant, or something that you can't connect to because you don't have a connection with that country. But there certainly should be chunks of this chapter that you identify closely with. And let me try and bring some of those things out. But first, let me talk about the three dimensions that I look at in this chapter to analyze news, to analyze the differences in news across the countries that we're studying. One dimension is bias versus objectivity. I kind of have addressed that already in my opening for class today, but it really has to do with how you like to at least have your perception in the general populace. How does the general public perceive of your media organization is what I'm trying to say. Do they perceive it as a biased organization or an objective organization? It depends on who you ask. If you ask a conservative in this country, they're not going to see Fox as biased. If you ask a liberal in this country, they're not going to see MSNBC as biased. But both of those stations looked at somewhat objectively, both of those channels, those networks, I should say, those cable channels are also biased. MSNBC to the left, Fox News to the right. So it really depends on who you ask. So it's really more about what are you striving towards. And we do see an overall trend across the world in newspapers for sure of trying to move towards objectivity, though bias still may exist there. It's one of the dimensions that I use to look at media systems in our countries. The second dimension is entertainment versus serious news. This has to do with, is the content overall, is it of an entertaining quality? Is it designed to amuse you, to make you laugh, to crack you up, to have you you be voyeuristic, or is it serious? Is it to get you to think about issues, sometimes issues that you don't want to deal with, but it's the reality of the human condition, starvation, poverty, crime, etc.? Is the information trying to get you to debate with others? Is it trying to get you to go out and vote? Entertainment versus serious news. And then thirdly, we have depth versus brevity. Depth versus brevity. Depth is when you really drill down into a subject that you're reporting on, and you do that either by covering the story over several days in a newspaper or devoting more time inside of radio and TV, even beyond 30 seconds to 60 seconds across multiple days. You can get depth in different ways versus brevity, which is just mentioning that something's going on but not really providing a lot of details. Sort of thinking of it as headline news. We know that there's a tsunami headed towards New Zealand. And that's all we know. When's it coming? What are the causes? How many tsunamis have they had before? How dangerous is it likely to be? What causes tsunamis? Lots of those questions can't get answered when you're only reporting something in 15, 30 seconds. So moving into the countries now, we start with France. And France is a country that has very serious newspapers. We've noted that. No tabloids whatsoever in France. We know that broadcasting-wise, they tend to be very objective in their approach. They try to be objective. We can say that both the government and the private stations have entertaining qualities to the broadcasts that go on, the TV shows. If you look at TV, as we'll find out in a later chapter in this book, a lot of shows are actually American. The Big Bang Theory, I'm sure, is there. I would imagine that Shameless is available in France. And there's just a lot of entertainment programming. The Kardashians, I'm sure they know all about them in France. Across both the private and the government stations, in part because the government, remember, uses advertising in their channels. And when you have advertising, it drives things more towards a bigger audience. And to get a bigger audience, audiences are usually interested in more entertainment. So that's sort of what marks the French, I would say, news landscape. We can go on now to Sweden, and we can say that in Sweden, one of the things that's constantly sort of editorialized, which means it's a bias in the newspapers, is socialism in Sweden. And sort of like how in the U.S., when we mention capitalism, we usually mention it to compliment it, even though, oddly enough, we don't use the word that much. But we do think of ourselves as capitalists. We usually mention it as good. We talk about the benefits of the free market, for example. I'm at this upcoming health debate that's going to happen under a Trump presidency is probably going to debate how the market forces can do some good for whatever reforms he's going to propose. That's a built-in bias to our system. In Sweden, it's the opposite. They have a socialist bias, so they talk about caring for people. They will talk about, for example, a husband and wife having a baby, and how, because of a government program, the husband is able to stay home for 6 months with the baby and not lose his job when he goes back to work. So they would talk about how that's very progressive, how that's a good example. They won't use socialism either, but they'll talk about it as a way of the government should be involved in people's lives, but it really is socialism. So you find a lot of that in newspapers in Sweden. And then also in Swedish newspapers, they have a unique feature called debate pages. These are pages, I think it's page 5 in the newspaper, but it's a place that the nation goes to have a public conversation about serious issues of the day. For example, debating let's say the death penalty, or debating the carbon footprint of the country. Sweden has a goal to be totally free of combustible fuels sometime in the future. That's one of the things that they've come up with that they want to do that's important to them, gasoline, etc. That would play out on these debate pages, and people would look at these pages, and there would be a big argument in favor one day, and then the next day a negative argument, and then back and forth like that until it plays out, maybe over 2 weeks. And this is taking place in all of the major broadsheet newspapers, so it's sort of a societal tradition within a newspaper dialogue. Another bias that you find out is that Swedish papers are very, very direct and open. I want you to look at a photograph in the book. I don't have the page number, but in this chapter, and look at the photograph of a cesarean section. This is a way of giving birth that is very intrusive. You cut the woman's abdomen to remove the baby, oftentimes because it's to save the health of the baby and or the mother, but it is a very intrusive process. And here's a photograph of that on the front page of a Swedish newspaper, and it's no problem. We could never do that in the United States. There would be such outrage over how that violated a sense of decency, but in Sweden it's a totally different story. Also in Sweden, newspaper-wise, the mornings are very, remember that's what we call the morning newspapers, very serious. The broadsheets in the mornings. The afternoons, as they call them in Sweden, are the tabloids, and they have a lot more sensationalism and entertainment, usually related to crime. There is no real bias on Swedish television news or radio. Moving on to the UK now. The UK, the newspapers have so much personality in the UK. If you're a Sun reader, you know exactly what a Mirror reader is. And if you're a Mirror reader, you know exactly what a Daily Mail reader is. And you know what an Observer reader is, and a Guardian reader is, and a Times reader is. These are those are all newspapers. I hope you recognize that I've just mentioned. And I want you to go to the books. There's a very interesting description on page 265 that captures the personality of each of the main newspapers in the UK, page 265, and it's very blunt. You'll see when it gets to the end. But it speaks to the fact that these newspapers have a long-standing relationship with their audiences, and they are known as being very political, very left, right, center. Center is out. In England, newspapers, they're left or right, and there's even a newspaper that's a very royalist newspaper, the Daily Mail. It's always promoting the positives of the royal family. So newspapers are just full of a bias in terms of personality in the UK. When it comes to commercial radio and TV, we'll see the same division that we see in other countries, which is generally speaking the public stations, which is the BBC stations, radio and TV, versus the private stations. The public stations do tend to have more documentaries. They tend to have more serious programming, more news, more cultural programming. The private stations tend to be more like our TV, lots of advertising, try to get the biggest audience possible, laugh tracks, the whole deal is mostly about entertainment. That's not to say, though, that the public stations aren't entertaining. I think that word entertaining is problematic. Even since I've written the book, I kind of regret using that because you can have entertaining. It depends on what prism you view it through. It's like cultural myopia, that term I described at the very beginning of this class, where if you look at things through your own experience, then you'll see a kind of bias in what you're looking at. So when we look at entertainment, we think that it should be contestant TV, people getting fired, people getting knocked off, people having romantic relationships, versus a documentary with, that's not entertainment, but documentaries, depending on how they're done, if they're done with ordinary people, we can almost say that Shameless, it's a fiction, but it's almost borrowing documentary techniques. If you've seen it on Netflix, and it's about a really dysfunctional family in Chicago involved in all kinds of things that are just way beyond the pale as far as social norms goes, with drugs, sex, and just breaking the law in general. But the technique for recording it is very documentary-like. So that's what I'm trying to say happens in documentaries in these European countries, because they have the money to make them really well produced. All right, it's a little bias on my part. All right, I want to go on now to say one more thing about the UK. There's a lot of weather news because it's a small country and it's an island. The weather changes all the time and very, very quickly. All right, moving on to the USA now. The USA, we generally speaking have an ideal of objectivity. We try to be objective. We try to promote that as a goal of our journalism. So even though we may have an editorial page in a newspaper that may lean to the left, like in the New York Times or in the Washington Post, those newspapers also try to balance that by having straight reporting, objective reporting on the news pages. The editorial is seen, in other words, as a separate place for opinion. So we have that happening in the U.S. We also, by the way, have some right-wing or to-the-right papers, too, like the Washington Street Journal and the Washington Times. As Wall Street Journal and the Washington Times. So we can say that is built in. Also, we have some built-in biases to the U.S., like I mentioned at the outset with calling us the leader of the free world. Similarly speaking, we often refer to ourselves as the greatest country in the world, which is really kind of a silly concept if you're a traveler, because you know that there is no greatest country. It's like asking you, who's the greatest sister in your family? What? Who's the greatest brother? Great at what? It depends on what you're asking, Is the United States a great country in terms of a melting pot of people? Yeah, for sure. The greatest? Maybe, although I do hear Trinidad in the Caribbean has the most diverse set of peoples from ethnic backgrounds in the entire world. I don't know about that. But is U.S. the greatest at that? Perhaps. But is France the greatest at its medical system? The World Health Organization sure seems to think so. They rate it as the number one health system. So greatest country is kind of an immature concept to me. And we are a young country, and kind of like a young child. You sort of think the attention's on you and everybody's watching you. But in reality, if we want to have equality, we really should be thinking of our countries having strengths and weaknesses, and other countries having strengths and weaknesses too. So my point there is that when we see news reporting that talks about the greatest country in the world, that's a bias creeping through. We also have a bias towards entertainment in this country. It's the advertising base of financial support for our programs has created that dynamic, that most programs are not just trying to find a niche audience and really work with that audience to teach them something, to uplift them, to help them progress. You can find those programs. The vast majority of programs is to make you laugh, to make you go, wow, I can't believe that, I can barely handle that. It's to make you be entertained. Yeah. All right, moving on now, we're going to go to Mexico. And in Mexico, there is a reluctance to criticize state governments still, even though there are newfound freedoms. There is a reluctance to criticize state governments because of some of the fear of the past, of the retributions that have taken place. But the criticism is flourishing in Mexico. It's just a little bit restrained. We do see political bias in most of the Mexican media. Most of the Mexican media, newspapers, radio, TV, across the spectrum, does line up behind a particular party. The particular party that's in power now is the PRI. This was the party that was in power for 71 years and then lost power when Vicente Fox came in, and then now it was back in power. And this is a political party that does enjoy bias on the part of all of the press, as do the state governments enjoy bias in favor of government on the part of all of the press because of that advertising insert situation that we discussed earlier in this class, where state governments and the federal government buy advertising space in a newspaper. I've got a Pocono record here on the back. On the back, we've got classified ads. We've got an ad up here for the Pocono record itself, asking you to advertise in the classified section. It's kind of a sign that they have space to burn. I hate to say it. Here's a wrecking service, just to get a normal ad in here. On the back of Mexican newspapers, you would have a whole entire page dedicated to the agriculture department of your state of Pennsylvania or wherever you live. That ad has been purchased 6 months ahead of time. So in other words, newspapers, they rely on that revenue from state governments and federal governments. Therefore, they are more inclined to be favorable in the way that they report about them. We do have a lot of really detailed crime coverage in Mexico. That is something that is just prevalent in all newspapers. And as we noted earlier in the tabloids, we have a lot of what we consider to be very, very gory coverage, is showing a lot of blood. And corruption is a theme that is often covered in Mexican newspapers. It just seems to be an accepted coin of the realm to discuss Mexico and Mexican government. Moving now to China, we know that China has a distinct communist bias in almost everything that we've looked at so far in this class. We do know, though, that there is some agitation that's allowed. We call it, in this chapter, we call it advocacy reporting, where some environmental protection grants that have come in were covered as being money that was misspent. So again, it's criticism of a local municipal project that didn't use taxpayer money that well, but it's never going to be about the Communist Party, its party goals, its leaders. It's never going to be about relations between China and other countries. All of that is just off limits when it comes to Chinese news reporting. The CCTV, Central Chinese Television channels, there are many of them. They are all very specialized. You can see that a lot of them are having content that is high culture and education. A lot of money put into that. And then there's one channel that's supposed to try and improve China's relations and notoriety around the world, and that is the CCTV channel that is exported on cable on the web. And it wants people to think of China in better terms, because China's been a very isolationist nation, although it's been breaking out of that in recent decades. but it's not a lot of people know about China like they know about France, or even like they know about Brazil. So China has this channel to try and improve the image of people and the way that China is viewed. Then you have Ghana. Moving to Ghana now, the news is tries to be very objective, but again, similar to Mexico, tends to tilt towards the government. For different reasons, though. The reasons are that the Ghanaians don't want to see the government fall again. They want this young democracy that took hold in 2000 to be successful. So they're nervous about doing too much that causes a lack of confidence in the government, and then maybe a coup, maybe government engages in corruption, maybe the government is not successful economically. We see this more in the state newspapers, certainly, than we do in the broadcasters, and the broadcasters are just really kind of weak when it comes to any kind of reporting. They're still just trying to get their infrastructure such that they can cover 24 hours of programming and have something to put on the air that they have produced. So news is coming along. The news does tend to celebrate Ghanaian culture. They're trying to resurrect it and say all that stuff that got snuffed out during the slave trading years, the colors, the fabrics that we wear, the foods that we eat, the native dialects, let's bring that out. Let's bring that back. And so news is dedicated somewhat to doing that for Ghana, as you would expect in a developing media country. Now we move finally to Lebanon. Lebanon has bias across the spectrum, newspapers, radio, and TV, and really fragmented bias. I mean, it would be like saying, let's take an ideology of like Donald Trump, and it would be saying that these interests are so specialized that you would have Trump gun supporters, Trump immigrant policy agreeers, Trump people who are interested in infrastructure, and none of these three groups are going to be interested in each other's newspapers or radio stations or TV stations. They're just going to be interested in that single sort of issue, guns. That's maybe not a great analogy, but I'm trying to describe the way that Lebanon is factionalized according to religious and ethnicities. And that means that the audiences for all of these media are very, very tiny. Itself, it's the situation itself occurring within a tiny country. So sort of like the smaller the country, the more chance you have for factionalizing, certainly when you have a civil war in there. But it does mean that you're going to be following your station, yours alone, and maybe even somebody else in your family who you grew up with has a completely different political orientation. No, in the general scheme of things, it's close to yours, but it's different, and there's a media channel for it. And that's the way that we can describe Lebanon. So that's about it for news reporting. I hope you have a great day.